Thank you so much for the opportunity to address you today. I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'd like to talk about the way that the world's changing and the impact that that's going to have on the sort of skills and jobs that we'll see coming out in the future. And of course, the first thing to say is this is a global story. So it has as much to do with Australia as it has here in the UK and indeed in Europe. I'm going to talk about 5 areas that I think are changing the way that we work. And I'll say a little bit more about how I think they're going to play out over the coming decades. The first one is around global rebalancing. And I think what we're seeing there, and of course you see it very clearly in Australia, is the movement of resources, the movement of human capital, the movement of innovation from the developed West to the whole world. You'll know that there's a lot of conversations at the moment about frugal innovation and about how India and China in particular are becoming centers of ideas as companies learn how to innovate at a very low cost base. So the first area we see is about global rebalancing, and one can also include in that the continual migration from the land into cities. And of course, that's going to increasingly create these talent clusters that we're already seeing in California, but we're also seeing now arising in Germany and possibly in Singapore and also potentially in China. The second area I wanted to talk about is hyperconnectivity. You know, one of the fascinating things about the future is that within about a decade, 5 billion people will be connected to each other using their handheld devices. And the impact of the cloud will be that they're going to be able to download at very low cost, if their country allows them to. They will download what you might call abundant knowledge. And by abundant knowledge, I mean both all of the books that are currently being digitalized by Google and various other groups, but also institutions and individuals who are putting their knowledge on the web for free. So right now, for example, MIT, the professors at MIT are putting their lectures on the web for free. This hyperconnectivity, this abundant knowledge is going to have a profound impact, I believe, on the way that people are educated and indeed the opportunities that people have, even if they're born and brought up in the most remote areas. It's interesting, for example, that right now, children in Rwanda, every child in Rwanda is being given some sort of a computer from which to work. And I think the implications of that will be the further globalization of talent pools. And it also means that countries are going to be constantly competing with others. It's interesting to see that right now, for example, the Philippines is now being seen even more successfully as a business process outsourcing than India has been. The third area I want to talk about is demographic shifts. And of course, the most obvious piece to say there is about productive aging, the fact that so many of us are going to be living productive lives for longer than we'd ever anticipated. In fact, the view is that our children, 50% of them at least, are going to live to over 100 years old. That's got real implications on the way we think about work. Of course, it's got implications on pensions. And, you know, the other aspect of this whole demographic shift is that we now have potentially 5 generational cohorts at work, from the traditionalists, now in their 80s, to the Gen X, and of course Gen Y, who are now in their mid-20s. And there's a great deal of interest in that group. We've just finished a global survey of Gen Y, and what we've found is that they really are the first constantly connected generation that the world has ever seen. They're interested in work, they're interested in meaningful work, and they're going to focus really their attention on building their own human capital. The fourth area I want to talk about is what we might call the scramble for resources. And clearly the impact that constant globalization and constant industrialization has had is that all over the world people are extracting resources. Of course, Australia is a huge beneficiary of that. But what that means, of course, is that for resources like water, for resources like oil and gas, these are going to create all sorts of political and regional conflicts. And indeed, some of their byproducts, particularly CO2, is and will have an impact on the environment. And it's very interesting to see how some CEOs, Unilever's CEO would be an example of that, are actually being very explicit about the amount of CO2 they want to produce within their company. And by the way, if you start looking at the CO2 footprint of most companies, what you'll find is it's held in people moving, commuting into work in the morning, staying at work, and then flying to see other people. And that's why we think the future is going to be much more about virtual working, which, by the way, is tricky, much more about home-based working, and much more about working flexibly. The final piece I want to talk about is what we might call inequality. You know, one of the marvelous things about the future is that it's bringing ideas, wealth, opportunities to people in parts of the world that would never have expected it. But the other thing it's doing is concentrating wealth, and we're seeing an ever greater concentration of wealth. And that's partly because those people who have got skills which are scarce and valuable are now able to leverage them on a global scale. And at the same time, we've seen a massive hollowing out of work. And the work in particular that's been hollowed out is work that can either be outsourced to somebody less expensive. That's really seen the outsourcing of much clerical work, but also the replacing by technology. And I think that increasingly we're going to see even management jobs replaced by technology. So the youth unemployment that we're seeing in the West at the moment, you know, remember right now that Spain is experiencing more than 50% youth unemployment, is partly because of the economic woes of the West, but it's also because those first jobs that typically people would get when they're young have now either been automated or they've been outsourced. And so we're seeing a fundamental restructuring of the labour market. And in my view, and it's something that I argued in my last book, The Shift, I think that's going to lead to hyper-specialisation and to people focusing more and more on developing very deep skills.